The spotlight was on Alexander Sullivan, a figure that both intrigued and intimidated those who crossed his path. He was a man of contradictions, an eccentric millionaire known for his disruptive innovations in sustainable technology, yet cloaked in an air of loneliness that seemed impossible to penetrate. Despite his wealth and success, there was a void in his life, an unspoken quest for something greater than profits and accolades. "Mr. Sullivan, the board is ready," a voice interrupted through the intercom. "Let them wait," Alexander muttered, staring out of the vast window of his high-rise office. Below him, the bustling streets of San Francisco looked like an anthill of activity. People moving without pause, without purpose, he thought. With a sigh, he adjusted the sleeve of his tailored suit, revealing a faint scar that ran across his wrist. His eyes lingered on it for a moment before he pulled the cuff back over, hiding it from sight. A quick knock at the door was followed by the entrance of his assistant, Emily, a no-nonsense woman who had worked for him for the past 6 years. "They're getting restless, Alexander," she said with a hint of reproach, but her eyes softened as they met his. "It's just a presentation," he shrugged. "They can handle it without me." Emily folded her arms, a familiar gesture that signaled she wasn't leaving until she had his full attention. "It's not just any presentation. It's about your latest invention, the one you promised to unveil at the community fair tomorrow." His expression shifted, slightly more animated at the mention. "Right, the fair." He paused. "What do you think of it? The idea of showcasing something so futuristic to children? It's admirable, Alexander. These kids don't get opportunities like this," she replied earnestly. "But are you really going to attend?" Alexander's gaze returned to the window. "Yes. For once, I'll step out of my bubble." The following day, the community fair was bustling with energy. It wasn't the usual venue where Alexander Sullivan's inventions were revealed. There were no CEOs, no investors, no media frenzy. Instead, there were children from underprivileged neighborhoods, eager to experience something extraordinary. As he walked through the fairgrounds, he felt out of place. His expensive suit stood in stark contrast to the casual, worn-out clothes of the attendees. Children ran past him, chasing after balloons, while parents watched from folding chairs. "Mr. Sullivan," a woman from the organizing team called out. "Over here, please. The children are waiting to see the demonstration." He followed her to a small tent where a group of children, aged between 7 and 12, sat cross-legged on the ground. At the center was a sleek, black device, Alexander's latest creation. "This," he announced, projecting his voice, "is called the Clean Pod. It can purify a room's air in under 5 minutes, using only solar energy." The children's eyes widened, some whispering excitedly to each other. Just then, a small voice broke through the murmurs. "Is it like magic?" asked a young girl, her dark hair pulled back into 2 messy pigtails. She wore an oversized sweatshirt, clearly a hand-me-down, but her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Not quite," Alexander smiled, crouching down to her level. "It's just science." The girl stepped forward, examining the device with an intensity that seemed unusual for her age. "Can I touch it?" "Of course," he replied, surprised by her boldness. She carefully ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the device, then looked up at him with a critical gaze. "You could make it better, you know." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh? How?" "You could use a different kind of filter," she suggested confidently. "One that can trap smaller particles. I read about it once." "Really?" he asked, genuinely impressed. "And what's your name?" "Lucy," she answered simply. "I like to learn about things that can help people." There was something both endearing and unsettling about Lucy's maturity. She reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. "So, Lucy," he continued, "what would you do differently with the Clean Pod?" She thought for a moment. "I'd make it smaller, easier for people to carry around, and maybe use it to help my mom. She has breathing problems." Alexander's curiosity grew. "And where is your mother now?" Lucy's face darkened, her confidence fading momentarily. "She's at home. She doesn't come out much." A brief silence fell between them. Then, as if noticing something she hadn't before, Lucy's eyes fixated on his wrist. "You have a scar," she remarked. My mom is one like that too. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to your mom? He asked, unable to mask his interest. She never talks about it, Lucy said quietly, but she always looks sad when she sees it. In that moment, Alexander's past seemed to collide with the present. He looked at Lucy, feeling a strange connection, one that was both familiar and unsettling. The community fair had become unexpectedly personal for Alexander. Lucy's sudden, astute observations left him pondering as he wandered aimlessly among the booths. He couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter meant something more. Was it her boldness? Her intelligence? Or perhaps that eerie mention of the scar? A stark reminder of his own unresolved past? He felt an unfamiliar pull to learn more about the young girl. As the day continued, Alexander noticed Lucy's constant presence near the clean pod tent. She was not only observing but interacting with the device, explaining its functions to other children as if she were part of his team. "Hey, Lucy," he called, trying to sound casual as he approached. "You seem to know quite a bit about this stuff. Are you interested in technology?" She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the device. "Yes, but mostly the kind that helps people. I read about sustainable tech in the library. It's amazing what it can do." He watched her with a mix of fascination and disbelief. It was rare to meet someone so young, yet so focused on solutions to real-world problems. "Do you go to the library often?" "All the time," she replied quickly, glancing up at him. "They have a lot of books about inventions. I like to understand how things work." Alexander smiled. "Then I guess I should ask you to be my advisor, huh?" Lucy's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "Maybe," she teased. "But you'd have to listen to me first." Their banter was interrupted by a sudden gust of wind that sent papers flying from a nearby table. Lucy chased them down swiftly, grabbing each one with an agility that was unusual for a child her age. As she returned with the papers, Alexander noticed she was wearing mismatched sneakers, one larger than the other, as if scavenged from a donation bin. "Are you here alone?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "No, I came with my teacher," Lucy answered, pointing toward a tired-looking woman standing by a booth across the fairground. "She brought some of us from school. It's a special day for us, you know?" Before Alexander could respond, Lucy added with a tinge of excitement, "This is the first time I've been to something like this. We usually don't have enough money to go places." He felt a pang of guilt, realizing how distant his world of luxury was from hers. "I'm glad you're here, Lucy. I hope you learned something valuable today." She paused, her expression serious. "I've already learned something." "Oh, and what's that?" he asked, genuinely curious. "That people like you can make a difference," she said matter-of-factly. "But you probably already knew that." The sincerity of her words caught him off guard. "It's not always that simple," he admitted, glancing around. "Sometimes, it's easy to forget why we started doing this in the first place." Lucy tilted her head, studying him with a surprising depth. "Then maybe you need to remember." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with an innocence that was somehow wiser than her years. Before he could respond, Lucy's teacher approached, gently taking her by the shoulder. "Lucy, it's time to gather everyone," the teacher said warmly. "We need to get back to the school bus." "Wait," Alexander interjected impulsively. Can I come see your school sometime? Maybe we could work on some projects together." The teacher seemed taken aback by the offer, but Lucy's eyes widened with excitement. "Really? You'd do that?" "Yes, I would," he promised. "But only if you promise to keep giving me feedback on my inventions." Lucy grinned from ear to ear. "Deal." As they walked away, Lucy turned around one last time, waving enthusiastically. "Bye, Mr. Sullivan. Don't forget about the smaller filter." Alexander waved back, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through him. The fair, which he had initially attended out of obligation, had left a mark he hadn't anticipated. As the crowd thinned and the sun began to set, he found himself standing alone by the clean pod, lost in thought. His assistant, Emily, approached cautiously. "How did it go?" she asked. "It went different," he replied, still processing everything. "I met someone. An incredible little girl. Did she leave an impression?" Emily asked with a hint of teasing. You have no idea, he admitted, shaking his head. She's smart, driven, and she's already trying to improve my invention. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. She must be something special then. She is, Alexander murmured. And there's something about her, about the way she talked about her mother's scar, that felt familiar. Emily's expression shifted to one of genuine concern. Do you think it's just a coincidence? Alexander's jaw clenched. I don't know, but I intend to find out. The next morning, Alexander was restless. His thoughts kept circling back to Lucy's piercing words, her curious nature, and especially the reference to her mother's scar. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a chance encounter. The scar, it was a detail that touched a raw nerve, a piece of his own painful history that had never quite healed. Emily, he called out as he walked into his office, his voice unusually urgent. She looked up, surprised by the urgency in his tone. Yes, Alexander? I need you to find out everything you can about Lucy, where she lives, who her mother is, and anything else that might help me understand. The situation, Emily raised an eyebrow, but didn't question him. It wasn't the first time he had made such a request, but there was something different in his voice, an edge of vulnerability she rarely heard. I'll get started on that right away, she replied. Alexander nodded, grateful. And Emily, be discreet. I don't want to cause any trouble. With the research underway, Alexander couldn't resist taking matters into his own hands. That afternoon, he found himself driving through the rundown streets of Lucy's neighborhood. The contrast to his world was stark. Peeling paint, barred windows, and children playing in narrow alleys. He parked his sleek black car a few blocks away from the school he remembered Lucy mentioning. As he approached, he saw a familiar figure standing outside the gates. It was Lucy, accompanied by an older man who seemed to be her teacher. The man looked tired, but his demeanor was warm as he guided the children towards the entrance. You must be Mr. Sullivan, the man said, noticing Alexander's presence. I heard about your visit to the fair yesterday. Quite generous of you to take an interest in our school. Please, call me Alexander, he corrected, extending a hand. And you are? Mr. Patterson. The teacher introduced himself with a firm handshake. I teach science here, and Lucy is one of my brightest students. I gathered that much, Alexander replied with a faint smile. She certainly has a sharp mind. Indeed, Mr. Patterson agreed. She's always had a knack for figuring things out. It's just her circumstances that hold her back. Alexander's curiosity deepened. What do you mean? Mr. Patterson hesitated, as if considering how much to reveal. Well, it's not my place to say, but Lucy's had a difficult upbringing. Her mother works several jobs, and Lucy often fends for herself. It's remarkable how she's managed to excel academically despite it all. Alexander felt a mix of admiration and unease. I'd like to meet her mother. Do you think that's possible? The teacher looked taken aback. Lucy's mother is very private. She rarely attends school events or engages with other parents. But if you're truly interested, you might catch her at the end of the day. She comes by to pick up Lucy sometimes. I understand, Alexander said thoughtfully. I'll wait. As the school day ended, Alexander stood near the entrance, trying not to appear out of place. When Lucy emerged from the building, her face lit up upon seeing him. Mr. Sullivan, she exclaimed, running up to him. What are you doing here? I came to see your school, he said, his smile genuine, and maybe catch up with you. How was your day? It was okay, she replied, adjusting the strap of her worn-out backpack. But why would you want to see my school? It's just old. He chuckled. It's not about the building, Lucy. It's about the people inside. People like you. She seemed pleased by his words, but then grew cautious. Are you here to see my mom? Yes, he admitted. If that's okay. Lucy's expression became guarded. She doesn't like talking to strangers. Before Alexander could respond, a woman appeared behind Lucy, moving with a cautious gait. She had long, dark hair tied in a messy bun, and her clothes were plain and well-worn. The resemblance was undeniable. There was a certain tired strength in her eyes that matched Lucy's. And then, As she reached to touch Lucy's shoulder protectively, Alexander saw it. A thin, jagged scar that ran along her wrist, almost identical to his own. His heart raced, but he maintained his composure. "You must be Lucy's mother," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Alexander Sullivan." The woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "I know who you are," she said, her voice low but steady. "What do you want with my daughter?" "I only want to help," he replied, trying to sound as genuine as possible. "I was impressed by her ideas, and I'd like to offer some support." The woman's eyes softened slightly but remained wary. "Support? From a man like you? Why?" "Because I see potential in her," he explained earnestly. "And because there's something about this situation that feels personal." "Personal?" she echoed, her suspicion deepening. Alexander's voice lowered, his vulnerability surfacing. "Yes, the scar on your wrist. I have one too." The woman's face turned pale, and her grip on Lucy tightened. "You need to leave," she said urgently, her voice shaking. "Now." Lucy looked confused, glancing back and forth between the two adults. "Mom, what's going on?" "It's nothing, sweetie," the woman assured her, her tone forced. "Just someone who shouldn't be here." "But," Lucy began, only to be cut off. "No," her mother insisted firmly, her eyes locked on Alexander. "Go home. You don't belong here." Alexander felt an overwhelming sense of loss as he watched the two walk away, Lucy's questions lingering in the air. As he returned to his car, his mind raced. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. There was more to Lucy's mother than he realized, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The day after his unexpected encounter with Lucy's mother, Alexander felt a restless urgency that was impossible to shake. He tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to that brief, intense moment. There was no mistaking the scar. It was exactly like his. Memories he had long buried began to surface. The sterile smell of the lab, the blinding flash of an explosion, and the searing pain followed by darkness. It was the accident that had nearly killed him years ago and had cost him someone he never thought he would see again. By the afternoon, his frustration turned into resolve. He picked up the phone and dialed Emily's number. "Emily, I need you to dig deeper," he said, his voice firm. "I want everything on Lucy's mother. I need to know who she really is." Emily hesitated before replying. "Are you sure, Alexander? This could get complicated." "Just do it," he insisted, trying to mask the desperation in his voice. "And be quick about it." Later that evening, as he sat alone in his luxurious penthouse, Alexander stared out over the glittering city skyline. The scene below was serene, but his thoughts were anything but. He couldn't help but wonder, could Lucy's mother be Elizabeth, his sister who was presumed dead in that very same accident? The very idea felt impossible, and yet it made a strange kind of sense. He had searched for answers about Elizabeth for years, but all leads had turned cold. Her body had never been found, and he had always harbored a sliver of hope that she might be alive somewhere. The following day, driven by a mix of hope and dread, Alexander decided to go directly to Lucy's house. He knew it was reckless, but he needed to know the truth. He found himself in front of a small, worn-down apartment building on the outskirts of the city. It was a far cry from the towering buildings that bore his name, but it had a warmth that those buildings lacked. As he knocked on the faded blue door, his heart pounded in his chest. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Elizabeth, his sister, alive and standing right in front of him. She was thinner, her face marked by years of hardship, but there was no mistaking her piercing blue eyes. They were the same eyes that had once looked at him with both admiration and rivalry. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "Is it really you?" Her eyes widened with shock, her expression a mixture of fear and recognition. "Alexander," she breathed, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" He took a step closer, unable to hide the raw emotion in his eyes. "I've been searching for you for so long. I thought you were dead." Elizabeth's face hardened, and she quickly stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "You shouldn't have come," she said coldly. You need to leave. Alexander's eyes filled with hurt. I can't just walk away, not after all these years. I have so many questions. Elizabeth crossed her arms defensively, her voice laced with bitterness. I have questions too, but this isn't the place for answers. Lucy is inside, and she doesn't need to see this. Lucy, she's your daughter, isn't she? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Yes, she is. And I've done everything to protect her. Protect her from what? Alexander pressed, his voice rising. From me? From the truth? From people like you, she snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. People who put ambition above family, above everything else. The accusation stung, but Alexander refused to back down. It wasn't like that, Elizabeth. I never wanted you to get hurt. Elizabeth's expression softened, but only for a moment. But I did get hurt. We both did. And I had to make a choice. To protect Lucy from a world that nearly destroyed us both. Alexander's gaze fell to the ground, overwhelmed by guilt. Why didn't you let me know you were alive? I could have helped you. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. You don't understand, Alexander. After the accident, I was warned to disappear, to stay hidden, or Lucy and I would be in danger. Warned? By who? He demanded, his voice filled with both confusion and urgency. Elizabeth hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might be listening. I don't know who they were, but they knew everything about the accident, about our research, our family, even Lucy's existence. They told me that if I ever resurfaced, they would come for her. Alexander's heart sank as the implications set in. So you've been living like this, all because of a threat from someone you never even saw? Yes, she said simply, her voice breaking. But I did what I had to do to keep her safe. I didn't want her to grow up in a world of fear. Tears welled up in Alexander's eyes. I'm so sorry, Elizabeth. I never meant for any of this to happen. I was trying to build a better world, but I lost sight of what mattered most. She studied him, her expression filled with a mix of sadness and uncertainty. I don't know if I can trust you, Alexander. Not after everything. You can, he said earnestly. Let me help you now. Let me protect both of you. Elizabeth looked torn, but before she could respond, the sound of small footsteps approached the door from inside. Mom? Lucy's voice called out, filled with concern. Is everything okay? Elizabeth quickly wiped away her tears and turned back to the door. Yes, sweetie, everything's fine, she assured Lucy. Then, turning to Alexander, she added in a low, urgent whisper, You need to go. For Lucy's sake. Alexander hesitated, his heart breaking as he watched his sister retreat behind the closed door once again. But he knew this wasn't the end. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many secrets buried in the past that needed to be uncovered. As he walked back to his car, a new determination set in. Whoever had forced Elizabeth into hiding would have to answer for it. And this time, he wouldn't let fear or guilt hold him back. Alexander sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. The revelation that Elizabeth was alive, and the reality of how she had been forced to live, fueled a mix of anger and guilt that burned inside him. He had to face it. While he had built an empire, his sister had been left in the shadows, struggling to protect a child he had never known existed. The injustice of it all was unbearable. His mind replayed every detail of the encounter with Elizabeth. Her hardened expression, the weariness in her eyes, the desperation in her voice. It was clear that she had suffered deeply, and it was also clear that there was more to the story, more to the mysterious threats that had kept her in hiding. But before he could take any action, he knew he had to confront something much more personal, Elizabeth herself. 2 days later, he returned to the small apartment, determined not to leave without answers. He knocked on the door and was met with a long silence. Just as he was about to knock again, the door swung open, revealing Elizabeth, her face wary but resigned. I knew you'd come back, she said flatly. I can't walk away from this, he replied, his voice steady but pleading. We need to talk, Elizabeth. Really talk. She sighed heavily, stepping aside to let him in. The inside of the apartment was as modest as he had expected. simple furniture, faded wallpaper, and a stack of Lucy's schoolbooks piled on the kitchen table. "Lucy's at school," she said, as if reading his mind. "We have some time." Alexander took a seat at the table, unsure of where to begin. "I know I failed you," he admitted, the words painful but necessary. "I was so focused on my work, on my vision. I lost sight of everything else, including you." Elizabeth remained silent, her arms crossed defensively. "I need you to understand," he continued, his voice breaking. "I never stopped looking for you. I tried everything. Hired investigators, searched records. But it was like you vanished." She finally spoke, her voice filled with bitterness. "That's because I had to vanish. The people behind the accident weren't just after our technology, Alexander. They wanted me gone, and they threatened Lucy's life to make sure I stayed hidden." "Who are they?" he pressed, his voice low. "Do you know anything about them? Names, motives, anything?" Elizabeth shook her head slowly. "I never knew their names. They were always in the shadows, making sure I stayed scared enough to never contact you." Alexander felt his frustration growing. "I can't protect you if I don't know what we're dealing with, Elizabeth." She met his gaze, her eyes cold. "I don't need your protection. I've survived this long without you." "Is that really how you want to live?" he asked, his tone softening. "Constantly looking over your shoulder? Keeping Lucy hidden from the world?" Her eyes flickered with pain, and for the first time, her voice faltered. "What choice do I have? I did what I had to do." Alexander's voice was filled with regret. "You had a choice, Elizabeth. You had me, and I should have been there for you." Elizabeth's anger suddenly flared. "You were never there, Alexander. Not when it mattered. You were too busy being the genius, the visionary, while I was left to pick up the pieces." His shoulders slumped under the weight of her words. "You're right," he conceded. "I was selfish. But I'm here now, and I won't let anyone hurt you or Lucy again." Elizabeth's eyes softened, but her skepticism remained. "How can I trust you after all this time? After everything that's happened?" "You don't have to trust me right away," he said earnestly. "But let me prove it to you. Let me help." The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken memories and shattered dreams. Elizabeth looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to believe you, Alexander, but I've spent years building walls to protect Lucy and myself. I don't know if I can just tear them down." He reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly. "Then let's start small. Let me be part of Lucy's life, at least. She deserves to know her family." Elizabeth hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. "She's never had a family, Alexander. Just me. And I can't let her get hurt." "She's stronger than you think," he replied softly. "Just like her mother." Elizabeth's face crumpled, and she finally allowed herself to cry, years of suppressed pain and fear spilling out. "I was so scared," she confessed. "Scared that I'd lose her, just like we lost everything else." Alexander moved closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You won't lose her, and you won't lose me either. Not this time." They sat in silence for a while, both siblings processing the gravity of what had been lost and what could still be saved. Just as the atmosphere began to shift towards something hopeful, the front door swung open. Lucy burst in, her face flushed with excitement. "Mom, Mr. Sullivan!" she exclaimed, her eyes wide with surprise. "What's going on?" Elizabeth quickly wiped her tears, trying to regain composure. "Lucy, honey, Mr. Sullivan was just visiting." Lucy's gaze shifted between the two, sensing the emotional weight in the room. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "Yes," Alexander said, forcing a smile. "Everything is going to be okay." But as Lucy beamed with a childlike innocence, a sudden knock echoed from the door. Elizabeth's expression shifted immediately to one of fear. "Who could that be?" Lucy asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Elizabeth's eyes were filled with panic as she whispered urgently to Alexander, "Get out the back, now." It could be them. His heart raced, but he refused to leave. "I'm not running, Elizabeth. Not anymore." The knock became louder, more insistent. Elizabeth grabbed Lucy by the shoulders, her voice barely controlled. "Lucy, Go to your room and stay there. Now. Alexander stood beside her, ready to face whatever, or whoever, was behind that door. It was time to confront the dangers of the past head-on, no matter the cost. The pounding on the door grew louder, each knock more forceful than the last. Elizabeth's face was pale, her breath rapid with panic, while Alexander stood beside her, his jaw set in grim determination. Open up. We know you're in there. A deep voice shouted from the other side. Alexander, you don't understand, Elizabeth whispered urgently. They'll hurt you. They don't care who you are. Alexander shook his head firmly. I'm not leaving you, Elizabeth. Not again. With a final, desperate look at him, she reluctantly opened the door. Two men stood in the doorway, both wearing dark suits and cold expressions. One of them, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Alexander. Who's this? The man demanded, his voice gruff. He's just a friend, Elizabeth lied, trying to keep her voice steady. He was about to leave, but Alexander didn't move. He felt a surge of anger and protectiveness rising within him. I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice low and unwavering. What do you want with her? The scarred man smirked, unfazed by Alexander's presence. This doesn't concern you, rich boy. We have business with Ms. Sullivan. Alexander's eyes flickered with recognition at the name. They know who she is. They've known all along. And what business is that? He pressed, stepping forward. The man's smirk faded. You ask a lot of questions for someone who doesn't belong here. This is a warning. Stay away from her. You don't want to make this your problem. Alexander met his gaze without flinching. It is my problem. She's my family. Elizabeth's eyes filled with fear, but there was a hint of something else. Relief, perhaps, at his defiance. The second man, thinner but with a sinister air, finally spoke. Listen, Mr. Sullivan, he said smoothly. Elizabeth knows what's at stake here. We've been clear about the rules. Her staying hidden has been the agreement for years. We don't want to break that, but you're making things complicated. Who are you? Alexander demanded, his voice rising. Who do you work for? What do you want from her? The thinner man's eyes narrowed. That's not your concern. But since you seem intent on getting involved, consider this your final warning. Walk away now, or you'll regret it. Alexander's temper flared. I won't let you intimidate my sister. I don't care who you are. The scarred man took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Sullivan. We don't just want her. We want what she has. Alexander's mind raced, trying to piece together what he was hearing. What she has, he echoed. Are you talking about her research? The technology from the lab? The thinner man's expression darkened. Exactly. We want what she created before the accident. It's not just about her. It's about the breakthrough she's hiding. Alexander turned to Elizabeth, his eyes filled with shock. Is that true? Did you manage to preserve your research? Elizabeth's face was a mix of guilt and defiance. Yes, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I kept it hidden all these years. It's the only thing that could ensure Lucy's safety. The men exchanged glances, their patience clearly wearing thin. Enough talking, the scarred man growled. You have until the end of the week to hand over the research, or we'll take it by force. Alexander stepped forward, his voice filled with steely resolve. You'll have to get through me first. The men regarded him for a moment, as if assessing whether he was a real threat. Then, the thinner man leaned forward, his tone chillingly calm. You've been warned, Sullivan. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. With that, they turned and walked away, leaving a tense silence behind. Elizabeth slumped against the wall, her face etched with exhaustion and fear. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered, her voice cracking. You've just made things worse. Alexander approached her, his voice gentle but firm. I had to. I won't let them terrorize you anymore. Elizabeth looked up, her eyes filled with tears. You don't understand, Alexander. These people don't stop. They have power, resources, and they're ruthless. That may be, he admitted. But so am I. And I have resources too. I won't let them hurt you or Lucy. For a moment, The weight of their shared pain was too much to bear, and Elizabeth allowed herself to lean into Alexander's embrace. It was a small gesture, but it carried the promise of redemption, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. "Tell me everything," he urged gently. "I need to know about the research, about what happened after the accident, and why they're still after you." Elizabeth nodded slowly, her voice raw. "After the explosion, I was barely alive. I woke up in a strange hospital, and a man came to see me. He claimed to be part of a secret organization that wanted the technology one was developing." "What kind of technology?" Alexander asked, his curiosity piqued. "It was an energy source, something clean, sustainable, and more powerful than anything on the market," she explained. "It could have changed everything, but when they realized they couldn't control me, they tried to eliminate me." Alexander's mind whirled. "But why keep you alive?" "They needed the data," she answered bitterly. "I had the only remaining copy of the research, stored in a secure, hidden drive. They thought they could manipulate me into giving it up." He shook his head in disbelief. "And all this time, you were hiding to protect Lucy and the research?" "Yes," she whispered. "And now they've found us again." Alexander's expression hardened. "Then we'll make a stand. I have the resources, the security, and the influence to protect you." Elizabeth's voice was filled with doubt. "And what about Lucy? If they find out who she really is, they'll use her against us." "We won't let that happen," he vowed. "I'll keep her safe. But we need to act quickly." Just then, Lucy emerged cautiously from her room, her eyes wide with concern. "Is everything okay?" Elizabeth forced a smile. "Yes, sweetie. Everything's fine." But Lucy wasn't convinced. "Mom, who were those men?" Alexander stepped forward, his voice calm and reassuring. "They're just people who want something that doesn't belong to them. But don't worry, Lucy. We're not going to let them hurt you." Lucy's gaze shifted between her mother and Alexander. "Are you really going to help us?" "Yes," he promised, his voice steady. "We're in this together now." As the weight of the moment settled on them, Alexander felt a surge of hope amidst the fear. For the first time in years, he wasn't just fighting for success. He was fighting for family, for redemption, and for a chance to right the wrongs of the past. After the unsettling confrontation, Alexander knew there was no time to waste. The threats from the men weren't empty, and with Elizabeth's research now in the open, danger was imminent. He needed to ensure the safety of his newfound family, and quickly. The next morning, Alexander arrived at Elizabeth's apartment with his security team in tow. 2 sleek black SUVs parked outside, the men dressed in suits and armed with state-of-the-art equipment. It was a display of power, a clear message that Elizabeth and Lucy were no longer alone. "Elizabeth," Alexander called as he knocked on the door. When she opened it, her expression was one of confusion mixed with concern. "What's all this?" "It's protection," he said simply. "From now on, you and Lucy won't have to be afraid. These men will watch over you, and you'll stay somewhere safer than here." Elizabeth's face hardened. "And what makes you think I'll agree to that?" "Because staying here puts Lucy at risk," Alexander replied, his tone resolute. "I won't let her become collateral damage." Her resistance wavered, the fear in her eyes slowly giving way to acceptance. "Fine," she sighed. "But I want to know everything about this plan of yours." He nodded. "I'm taking you both to one of my properties. One that's secure, discreet, and far from here." Elizabeth hesitated. "How long will we be there?" "As long as it takes to end this," he said firmly. "I'll be working day and night to expose whoever is behind all this." Elizabeth's gaze softened, her voice barely above a whisper. "You really mean it, don't you?" "Yes," he assured her. "And not just because of the research, but because of you and Lucy. I won't let them destroy our family again." A short while later, Alexander, Elizabeth, and Lucy were seated in the back of an SUV, flanked by security vehicles. Lucy was wide-eyed, fascinated by the sudden shift in their lives. "Is this all because of me?" she asked quietly, looking up at her mother. "No, sweetheart," Elizabeth replied gently. "It's because of the people who want to take something from us. But your uncle is here to help." "Uncle Alexander," Lucy repeated, trying the words on for size. I like that. Alexander felt a warm swell in his chest, despite the circumstances. I like it too, he said with a smile. The convoy wound its way through the city streets before arriving at a secluded estate, surrounded by high walls and dense trees. The house was a sprawling, modern structure equipped with the latest security features: cameras, motion detectors, and reinforced windows. It was as close to a fortress as one could get within city limits. "This is where we'll be staying?" Lucy asked, her eyes widening at the sight of the house. "Yes," Alexander confirmed. "It's safe here. No one can get in without my approval." Elizabeth looked around, impressed but still wary. "This is a lot to take in." "I know," he admitted, "but it's necessary." Once inside, the head of Alexander's security team, a tall man named Greg, approached them. "Everything is in place, Mr. Sullivan. We'll have round-the-clock surveillance and a rotation of guards. No one gets near this house without clearance." "Good," Alexander replied, then turned to Elizabeth. "You can relax here. I'll make sure Lucy's school arrangements are handled discreetly." "Are you sure that's wise?" Elizabeth asked, her protective instincts kicking in. "Lucy deserves some normalcy," he reasoned. "And besides, we can have security nearby, just in case." Elizabeth nodded reluctantly. "All right, but if I sense any danger—" "You won't have to," he promised. Over the next few days, Alexander focused all his energy on finding answers. He gathered his most trusted allies, experts in cybersecurity, intelligence, and legal affairs, to unravel the mystery of the shadowy organization that had been stalking Elizabeth for years. It was a complex web of shell companies, hidden bank accounts, and anonymous threats. But Alexander was relentless. He had something to fight for now, something that mattered more than all his achievements combined. He spent late nights poring over files and leads, determined to trace every connection, no matter how obscure. Meanwhile, Elizabeth and Lucy adjusted to their new surroundings. Lucy, despite the upheaval, seemed to flourish under the protection of her uncle. She was particularly fascinated by the technology in the house and often shadowed Alexander, bombarding him with questions. "Uncle Alexander," she asked one afternoon, holding a small circuit board she'd found in one of his workshops, "is this part of your inventions?" He looked up from his laptop, smiling at her curiosity. "Yes, it's from an old prototype of mine. You can keep it if you want." Her eyes lit up. "Really? I want to try and make something with it." "Go ahead," he encouraged. "Just be careful." The bond between them was growing stronger each day, and even Elizabeth couldn't help but notice the change. One evening, as she watched Alexander help Lucy with her makeshift science experiment, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "Thank you," she said quietly, approaching Alexander. He looked at her, surprised by the softness in her voice. "For what?" "For being here," she said, her eyes glistening. "I didn't think I'd ever trust anyone again, but you're proving me wrong." Alexander's expression was filled with emotion. "I won't let you down this time, Elizabeth." But just as they were beginning to rebuild their trust, a new message arrived. An encrypted email that managed to bypass Alexander's security protocols. The message contained a single sentence: "We know where you are." Alexander's heart sank, and he immediately called for Greg. "We have a breach," he informed the security chief. "Lock down the perimeter and increase surveillance. No one leaves the property until we know more." Elizabeth, overhearing the conversation, felt her stomach drop. "What does it mean, Alexander?" "It means they're getting desperate," he replied grimly. "But that's a good thing. It means we're close." "Close to what?" she asked, her voice filled with fear. "Close to exposing them," he said confidently, "and ending this once and for all." The tension in the house was palpable as the night wore on. Lucy sensed the unease, clinging to her mother more than usual. Elizabeth stroked her hair, whispering reassurances, but her own fears were growing. "Will we ever be safe, Mom?" Lucy asked, her voice small. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but she forced a smile. "Yes, Lucy, we will be. Your uncle is here now, and he's not going to let anything happen to us." Outside, the guards patrolled the grounds, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, Alexander watched the security monitors, his resolve unwavering. The enemy was closing in, but so was he. He would stop at nothing to protect Elizabeth and Lucy, even if it meant confronting the darkest secrets of their past. The atmosphere at the safe house was thick with anticipation. Alexander's security measures had been reinforced, and his investigation was finally bearing fruit. His network of contacts, working around the clock, had managed to trace the anonymous threats to a former business associate, someone he had once trusted completely. That morning, as Alexander scanned through the latest intel, his phone buzzed with a call from Emily. "We've got a name," she said, her voice tense. "It's Marcus Voss." Alexander's heart tightened. Marcus had once been his closest ally, the co-founder of his company, before they had parted ways in a bitter dispute over ethics and direction. "Marcus," Alexander muttered, disbelief mingled with anger. "He's the one behind all this?" "Yes," Emily confirmed. "He's been funding a private group that specializes in securing high-stakes intellectual property by any means necessary." Alexander clenched his fist. So it was never just about Elizabeth's research. It was about revenge. Emily's voice grew serious. "And now that they know where you are, it's only a matter of time before they make their move." Alexander hung up, his mind racing. He had to confront Marcus, but doing so meant taking a calculated risk, one that could either end the threat or put his family in even greater danger. He found Elizabeth in the living room, pacing restlessly. She stopped when she saw his expression. "What is it?" "I know who's behind this," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "It's Marcus Voss." Elizabeth's face went pale. "Marcus? Your old partner?" "Yes," Alexander replied, the bitterness evident in his tone. "He's the one who's been hunting you, all for the research and a personal vendetta against me." Elizabeth's anger flared. "So this was never just about the technology? It was about destroying you?" "Both," he confirmed. "But now that we know who we're dealing with, we have a chance to stop him." Elizabeth's eyes were filled with fear. "And how do you plan to do that?" Alexander's gaze was steely. "I'm going to confront him directly. I'll demand a meeting." Elizabeth's shock was immediate. "That's too dangerous, Alexander. What if it's a trap?" "It probably is," he admitted. "But I won't let him continue this campaign of terror. I have to end it." Elizabeth shook her head, her voice cracking. "I can't let you do this alone. You have to stay here with Lucy," he insisted. "She needs you, and you both need to be safe." "I won't let Marcus hurt her." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but she knew he was right. "Just promise me you'll come back," she pleaded. "I will," Alexander vowed, his voice soft but resolute. "No matter what happens, I'll come back." He called Marcus from a secure line, keeping the conversation brief. "Marcus, it's Alexander," he said coldly. "I know what you've been doing. It ends today." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low, mocking laugh. Well, I was wondering when you'd figure it out," Marcus replied, his voice dripping with arrogance. "So, what now? Are you here to negotiate, or have you finally grown a spine?" "We meet in person," Alexander demanded. "No tricks, just you and me. I want to settle this once and for all." Marcus sounded almost amused. "Very well. You know where to find me." The meeting was set for a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Alexander's security team prepared for the worst, equipping him with a hidden transmitter and a bulletproof vest. As he left, Elizabeth stood by the door, her expression a mix of fear and hope. "Be careful," she whispered. "I will," he promised again, before disappearing into the night. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. Alexander stepped inside, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty space. A single light hung from the ceiling, casting a harsh glow over Marcus, who stood in the center of the room, flanked by two armed guards. "You've made quite a mess of things, Alexander," Marcus sneered as Alexander approached. "All this trouble over a piece of technology. It's more than just technology, and you know it," Alexander shot back. "It's about what it represents, a future you tried to control." Marcus laughed again, but his eyes were cold. "Control? No, Alexander. It's about power. The power to change the world on my terms." "You destroyed everything we built," Alexander said, his voice filled with years of betrayal. But you won't touch my family. Not now, not ever. Marcus's smirk faded, replaced by a look of genuine menace. You're too late. I already know where Elizabeth and Lucy are. The only question is, how far are you willing to go to save them? Alexander's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. I'll do whatever it takes. Marcus nodded, as if expecting that answer. Good, because this is where we finish it. Suddenly, the two guards raised their weapons, but before they could act, Alexander's backup stormed in, Greg and the security team, guns drawn. Marcus's expression twisted with rage. You think you can outmaneuver me? I just did, Alexander retorted. It's over, Marcus. But Marcus wasn't done yet. In a desperate move, he reached inside his coat and pulled out a small device, a detonator. You may have won this battle, but I'll take everything with me, he threatened. Panic surged through Alexander. Don't do it, Marcus. You'll destroy yourself. Marcus's eyes were wild. Then we both go down. But before Marcus could press the button, a shot rang out, and he fell to the ground, the detonator slipping from his hand. Greg lowered his weapon, his face grim. It's over, he said. Alexander stood over Marcus, a mix of relief and horror washing over him. Marcus was still alive, but barely. The police, who had been alerted by Alexander's team, arrived within minutes, taking Marcus into custody. As Alexander watched Marcus being led away, he felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. The fight was over, but the wounds ran deep. He returned to the safe house, where Elizabeth and Lucy were waiting anxiously. The moment he stepped through the door, Lucy ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist. You're back, she cried, her voice filled with relief. Yes, he said, kneeling down to her level. I promised I would. Elizabeth approached slowly, tears of both relief and gratitude streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. It's done, Alexander said simply. We're safe now. But even as they embraced, Alexander knew that the real work was just beginning, rebuilding trust, family, and a future that had once seemed lost forever. Despite Marcus's capture, the sense of unease lingered. As Alexander, Elizabeth, and Lucy tried to resume a semblance of normal life at the safe house, there were still loose ends that kept Alexander on edge. The organization behind Marcus remained shrouded in mystery, and Alexander feared they might still be watching, waiting to strike again. One night, as Alexander was reviewing new security protocols with Greg, he received an urgent call from Emily. Alexander, she said, her voice filled with urgency. We have a problem. His grip tightened around the phone. What is it? It's about Marcus, she continued. He's made a deal with the authorities. In exchange for his cooperation, he revealed that there's a plan in motion, something that involves a direct attack on the safe house. Alexander's heart raced. When? Soon, she warned. We don't know the exact time, but we've confirmed that it's happening. Alexander hung up, his mind reeling. He called Greg immediately. Get everyone into high alert. We're expecting an attack. Greg nodded, his face grim. We're ready, sir. Alexander quickly gathered Elizabeth and Lucy in the living room, his expression serious. We're in danger, he said plainly. There's a chance they'll come for us tonight. Elizabeth's face turned pale, her voice barely steady. How can they still know where we are? I thought we were safe. I underestimated their reach, Alexander admitted, his voice filled with frustration. But we have a chance to stop this once and for all. I have reinforcements coming, but we need to be prepared. Lucy, sensing the fear in the room, clung to her mother. Mom, I'm scared, she whispered. Elizabeth knelt down, holding Lucy tightly. It's going to be okay, Lucy. Your uncle is here. Alexander's eyes softened as he watched them. We'll get through this. I promise. The hours that followed were tense, with the house surrounded by heavily armed guards. Surveillance cameras fed live footage into a central monitor, showing every corner of the property. Greg moved quickly, coordinating the team and setting up barricades at key entry points. And then it happened. Just after midnight, the alarms blared. Through the security cameras, Alexander saw dark figures approaching the estate. It was a coordinated assault, with at least a dozen armed men moving silently across the grounds. "Get them to safety," Alexander ordered Greg. "Take Elizabeth and Lucy to the secure room." Greg nodded, rushing to comply. But Elizabeth's resistance was immediate. "I'm not leaving you," she said firmly. "You have to," Alexander insisted. "Lucy needs you, and you need to be safe." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes, but she relented, grabbing Lucy's hand. "Come on, sweetie. We're going to a safe place, just for a little while." As they disappeared down a hidden hallway, Alexander turned his focus back to the approaching attackers. He took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment he had been preparing for. The past could no longer be avoided. It had come to them, and now he would face it head-on. The gunfire erupted, echoing through the estate. Alexander and his security team returned fire, moving strategically from cover to cover. The attackers were well-trained, but they were up against a well-prepared defense. Alexander's adrenaline surged, but his mind remained clear. He moved with precision, using every skill he had acquired over the years. He could hear Greg's commands over the radio, directing the guards and maintaining a tight perimeter. In the chaos, one of the attackers managed to breach the interior. Alexander spotted him in the corridor, weapon raised. Without hesitation, he fired, the sound of the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. The man dropped to the ground, motionless. But there was no time to rest. Two more attackers rushed through a side entrance, and Alexander barely had time to react. He dove behind a heavy oak table, bullets splintering the wood above him. "Greg," he shouted into the radio, "we've got a breach inside." "On it," Greg responded, sending two guards to cover Alexander's position. As the fight raged on, Alexander's determination grew stronger. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for Elizabeth, for Lucy, for the chance to finally end the nightmare that had haunted them for so long. After what felt like an eternity, the gunfire began to slow. The attackers, realizing they were outmatched, started to retreat. Alexander's men pursued them, securing the perimeter and ensuring there were no more threats. The silence that followed was eerie. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. Alexander's ears rang from the gunshots, but he pushed forward, desperate to reach Elizabeth and Lucy. He found them in the secure room, both shaken but unharmed. Elizabeth ran to him, tears streaming down her face. "You're okay," she breathed, relief overwhelming her. "I'm okay," he assured her, holding her close. He then knelt down to Lucy's level. "We're safe now," he said gently. Lucy's eyes were wide, still filled with fear. "Are they gone?" "Yes," Alexander confirmed. "They're gone." But as he comforted them, a sharp, urgent voice crackled through his earpiece. "Alexander, we found something," Greg reported. "You need to see this." He quickly followed Greg to one of the captured attackers, who was being held by two guards. The man's face was bloodied, but his eyes were defiant. "Who sent you?" Alexander demanded, his voice low and cold. The attacker smirked, spitting blood onto the ground. "You think you've won? You're a fool." This was just the beginning. Alexander's anger flared. "Tell me who's behind this." The man's expression turned sinister. "There's more at stake than you realize. It's not just about you, Sullivan. It's about everything you've built and everything you've lost." The words chilled Alexander to the core, but the attacker refused to say more. As he was led away, Alexander felt both relief and unease. The immediate threat had been stopped, but the deeper conspiracy remained. Returning to Elizabeth and Lucy, he felt a heavy weight lift from his shoulders. They were safe, for now, but the fight wasn't over. Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. "Is it really over, Alexander?" "No," he admitted, "but it's the beginning of the end." The morning after the attack, the estate was eerily quiet. The guards were still stationed at every entry point, and the smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. Alexander stood at the large window, staring out at the sun rising over the city. The events of the previous night had left a deep impression, not just on him, but on Elizabeth and Lucy as well. The immediate threat was over, but he knew the fight to reclaim their lives was far from finished. The organization behind Marcus was still out there, wounded but not destroyed. However, Alexander felt a shift within himself, a new strength born out of this confrontation. He no longer felt like a distant guardian. He was now fully committed, ready to rebuild what had once been broken. He turned when he heard light footsteps. Lucy approached him, her small face filled with both relief and lingering fear. "Uncle Alexander," she said quietly, "are we really safe now?" He knelt down to her level, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Yes, Lucy, we're safer than we've been in a long time. But I want you to know something very important. No matter what happens, I'll always protect you." Lucy's eyes, filled with childlike wonder and a depth that seemed far too mature for her age, shimmered with a hint of tears. "I know," she whispered, then hugged him tightly. Elizabeth, watching from the doorway, wiped away a tear. She approached slowly, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you, Alexander. You didn't have to do all of this, but you did." He rose to his feet, looking deeply into her eyes. "I had to. I owe it to you, to both of you." For the first time, the anger and bitterness that had defined Elizabeth's expressions began to fade. "It's going to take time," she admitted. "Time for us to really trust each other again. But I want to try." "So do I," he agreed, his voice steady. "We have a lot to rebuild, but we'll do it together." In the days that followed, life at the estate began to settle into a new rhythm. With the immediate threat neutralized, Alexander and Elizabeth focused on repairing their fractured relationship. There were long conversations, some filled with tears, others with laughter, about their childhood, the years they had lost, and the dreams they still hoped to fulfill. It was a slow, delicate process, but the bond between them grew stronger each day. Alexander also made a point to connect with Lucy in more meaningful ways. He invited her to his lab, showing her prototypes of his latest inventions, and encouraged her creativity. Lucy, eager and curious, often asked questions that surprised him with their insight. "Why did you choose to make the clean pod?" she asked one afternoon, studying one of his devices. Alexander smiled, a mix of nostalgia and determination in his eyes. "Because I wanted to make the world a little better. But now, I want to do it for you too." Lucy grinned, nodding. "I think I'd like to help you make things better too." It was a simple exchange, but it marked a profound shift in Alexander's heart. He was no longer the lone visionary, isolated by his ambitions. He was now part of something much greater, a family. Despite the warmth of their newfound connection, there was still unfinished business. The organization that had orchestrated Elizabeth's hiding and the attacks remained active, albeit weakened. Alexander knew he had to confront them one final time to secure a true sense of safety for his family. With the help of his allies, Alexander tracked down key members of the organization, slowly dismantling their operations and exposing their corruption. It was a long, complex battle fought in boardrooms, courtrooms, and shadowy backrooms. Alexander's influence and resources were instrumental, but it was his relentless determination that ultimately broke the back of the sinister network. Months later, as the legal cases concluded and the final arrests were made, Alexander stood on the balcony of his penthouse, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The fight was over, truly over this time. He had fulfilled his promise. Elizabeth joined him on the balcony, a soft smile on her face. "You did it," she said quietly. "We did it," he corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. You're the one who kept the research safe all these years. You saved us all." Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something that spoke of forgiveness. "I never thought I'd get this chance, Alexander, to have a life where I don't have to hide anymore." "You don't have to hide," he assured her. "Not ever again." As they stood there, side by side, Lucy appeared behind them, holding a small notebook filled with sketches and notes. "Mom, Uncle Alexander," she called, her voice bright with excitement. "I think I figured out how to improve the CleanPod's filter." Alexander and Elizabeth both turned, their faces lighting up with pride. "Show us," they said in unison. Lucy ran over, placing the notebook on the balcony's railing. As she excitedly explained her ideas, Alexander felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a feeling he had long searched for but never truly understood until now. The sun was setting over the city, casting a warm, golden glow over them. It was a new beginning for all of them, one built on love, trust, and the promise of a brighter future. For the first time in years, Alexander felt at peace. He had found not just success, but purpose, a purpose defined by the family he had reclaimed. A year had passed since the final confrontation, and life had found a new rhythm for Alexander, Elizabeth, and Lucy. The house they now called home wasn't the secure fortress it once had been, but a warm and welcoming place filled with laughter, love, and the chaos of everyday life. The morning started with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of Lucy's footsteps rushing down the stairs. Today was special. It was the unveiling of a new sustainable technology project at Alexander's company, and Lucy was a key part of it. "Ready, champ?" Alexander asked, a smile tugging at his lips as he watched Lucy adjust the collar of her blazer. She nodded eagerly, her face glowing with excitement. "More than ready. I can't wait to show them our new invention." The project, developed over the past year, was a next-generation version of the Clean Pod, a compact device that not only purified air but also filtered water. The innovation had Lucy's fingerprints all over it, from the improved filters to the intuitive design. It was the first product launched under the new branch of Alexander's company, aptly named Sullivan & Company, Future Innovators. At the launch event, Alexander took the stage, addressing a crowd of journalists, engineers, and children from underprivileged schools who had been invited to witness the moment. He cleared his throat, glancing down at Lucy, who stood by his side with pride shining in her eyes. "This invention," Alexander began, his voice steady, "is not just about technology. It's about what's possible when we come together, driven by hope and determination. It's about family." The crowd erupted into applause as Lucy stepped forward to demonstrate the device, her confidence radiant. As she explained how it worked, her eyes occasionally darted to Elizabeth, who was standing nearby, capturing the moment with a camera. Elizabeth's face was filled with tears of joy, overwhelmed by how far they had come. When the presentation ended, Alexander and Lucy walked off the stage, greeted by Elizabeth, who immediately pulled them both into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "We did it, Mom," Lucy said softly. "We really did." "Yes, we did," Alexander added, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And this is just the beginning." As they made their way back home that evening, the sky turned a soft shade of orange, the city lights beginning to twinkle. Lucy leaned against Alexander in the back seat, her head resting on his shoulder. "Uncle Alexander," she murmured, her voice sleepy but content, "do you think we'll always be this happy?" He kissed the top of her head gently. "Yes, Lucy. No matter what comes, we'll face it together." Back at home, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Elizabeth raised her glass, a rare moment of formal celebration. "To us," she declared, her eyes sparkling with hope. "To a future where we're not just survivors, but creators." They clinked their glasses, laughter filling the room. It wasn't just a toast. It was a promise of a brighter tomorrow, a tomorrow filled with love, courage, and endless possibilities. Alexander looked around, his heart full. He had finally found what he'd been searching for all along, not in boardrooms or labs, but in the eyes of the family he had rediscovered. In that moment, as he watched Elizabeth and Lucy laugh, he knew that they were more than just his past. They were his future. And this time, nothing would tear them apart.